Well, greetings. Pastor Eric here from Zion Lutheran Church in beautiful, sunny Redmond. Good to be with you today on day 15. We're on the second part of looking at the seventh sign in John 11, the raising of Lazarus. And we looked at some of the brief details yesterday, and what happens is Mary and Martha and Jesus and several others go to the tomb where where there was much weeping and wailing. And John 11:35, while he was there, they say, "Lord, if you were here, my brother would not have died." You know that story that we talked about yesterday about how Jesus waited and the whole background to that. But John 11:35 is the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Back in my first church, the kids had to memorize Bible verses, and one particularly unruly kid said, "Well, okay, I'll memorize a Bible verse, but what's the shortest verse in the Bible?" And I said, "Jesus wept, John 11:35. He said, "I'll take that one." Well, anyway, Jesus wept. It's actually two words. Jesus began to weep is in the NRSV. But Jesus wept is such a short and important verse of the Bible. It tells us that genuine faith doesn't mean that we lose all emotion. It tells us that emotion is good. It tells us that if you really trust God, and if you really know that God is going to work it out in the end, if you know that there's a heaven for you, if you know that all the problems that you have on earth will be resolved by Jesus in heaven, that you can still weep. You can still have deep, deep emotion. It says that even though things will be okay one day, that you can still experience deep emotion and grief. Now, remember yesterday I said when Jesus waited, it was kind of like, "Oh, come on, why don't you go?" Well, so the glory of God might be revealed. But here, he could have said to them, "Hey, stop your crying, buck up, buddy." He could have said, "Why don't you just wait until I show you what I can do? Stop your sniffling." Instead, with the deep weeping and wailing that was all around him, Jesus wept with them instead of trying to fix it. Most guys are fixers. When there's a problem around the house, you fix it. Or when there's a problem that your spouse has or something, you want to just fix it. But sometimes it's more important than fixing things like Jesus could have done. Sometimes it's more important to enter into the emotion of the person that you're around, to listen, to be with someone with their grief and their frustration. So let me read verses 38 to 44. 38 to 44. Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lying against it. Oh, where have we heard that? Oh, that's right, Jesus, the same thing. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Mary, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, it's going to be stinky winky if you open it up because he's already been dead for 4 days. Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you will always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." Right? When he had said this, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Now, couple things to notice here. Jesus was greatly moved, deeply moved to his heart. He wept. He was deeply moved. He cared deeply. He loves deeply. Jesus is more emotional here than in any of the other Gospels, any place. Jesus shows more emotion right here than anywhere else in any of the Gospels. He says to them, roll the stone away. He gives them something to do rather than doing an abracadabra, roll the stone away. He gives them something to do. He gets them to participate in the miracle. That's a very important theme in the gospel. Jesus asks the people to do something. Go show yourself to the priest, the blind man, go take up your pallet, whatever it is. He invites people, the disciples distributing the bread and the fish. He invites people into the miracle, and then he tells them to take off the grave cloths and let him go. He invited them into the miracle so that they could do what they could do to see what God could do. They could do what only they could do, and they saw what only God can do. Finally, notice what Jesus asked them to do. Verse 44, sorry for the cough. He says, the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of cloth, and his feet bound, face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus says, unbind him and let him go. Wrapped in a strip of cloth around his face. Remember the Easter sermon when I talked a little bit about that? So Lazarus was bound with strips of cloth. Oh, that's right. Remember who else was bound and wrapped in strips of cloth? Remember how Jesus was wrapped in swaddling clothes? It's not a romantic thing, it's strips of cloth. They lined up the baby in strips of cloth when Jesus was born. Jesus would one day become unbound to show the real glory of God. Jesus would one day become whole in order to show the glory of God. So think of that story of the raising of Lazarus. Think of how this was the final straw that broke the back of the Pharisees so that they decided they needed to put him to death after this. So remember from this story that when you're alone in a valley, when you feel like you're in a tomb, when you feel there's no way out, when you feel something like a big rock is holding you back, something even like this pandemic, when you feel alone, remember that Jesus weeps with you, for you, about the situation you're in. Remember the strips of cloth that wrapped Lazarus and wrapped Jesus that would one day in the time following Lazarus would bring people to faith in the marvelous work of God, who came to us like that little baby wrapped in strips of cloth lying in a manger, who became the Christ of the cross, who comes into our midst to love us and free us and forgive us. Remember that Jesus is the babe of the manger. He's the Christ of the cross. Remember Lazarus, wrapped in strips of cloth. He came out, and through that, the glory of God was made known. Now remember, chapter 12, he goes into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and that begins the whole events that lead to the death of Jesus. He spends 4 chapters, 13 through 17, in the upper room with the disciples, teaching them and leading them about what is most important. On Monday, we're going to start to look at 7 people that Jesus came in contact with, since we're now, after these 3 weeks, done with the 7 signs. On Monday, we're going to start with the 7 people. Then after that, we're going to look at the 7 I am sayings. So I'm going to read for you from Sarah Young, Jesus Calling, April 23rd. Keep your eyes on me, Jesus says, not only for direction, but also for empowerment. I never lead you to do something without equipping you for the task. That's why it's so important to seek my will in everything you do. There are so many burned out Christians who think that more is always better, who deem it unspiritual to say no. But in order to know my will, you must spend time with me, enjoying my presence. This is not an onerous task, but a delightful privilege. I will show you the path of life. In my presence is fullness of joy. At my right hand there are pleasures forevermore. That's the devotion for today. Spend some time this weekend just seeking God's face, being in God's presence on this beautiful weekend. be with God. Spend some time this weekend doing that. I look forward to seeing you on Monday, and until then, you take care. Bye-bye.